November 30th, 1942, 2:14 a.m., Iron Bottom Sound Guadalcanal. The night is a wall of blackness, the kind that swallows men whole. The sea is calm, but alive with whispers. Rain sliding across the deck. The faint buzz of insects carried from the jungle aboard PT 109. The air smells like oil salt and tension. The small wooden boat cuts through the darkness with 3 Packard V12s roaring like beasts of thunder. In the cramped engine room, Machinist's mate, second class, Robert Bobby Chen, keeps one hand on the throttles and the other on the bulkhead to steady himself. He's 22 years old, 9 months into his first combat assignment, and already older than most men will ever feel. He's lost count of how many nights he's patched bullet holes or rebuilt carburetors under fire. Tonight feels different. The kind of night where instinct whispers louder than orders. The intercom crackles through the noise. Cut engines go silent. Drift. Chen's stomach tightens. The words don't make sense. Cut the engines means death. It means floating blind in enemy waters with no power, no control, no escape. But he follows orders. His fingers hesitate on the throttle lever, sweat dripping into the grease on his palms. He can almost feel Morrison beside him. His best friend. His brother in everything but blood. Tommy Morrison, who used to joke about building hot rods after the war. Morrison, who burned alive 3 weeks ago when a shell tore through PT 44's engine room, Chen's engines. The same Packards that scream across the Pacific now sound like the devil himself, Three V12s. 4,500 horsepower, enough to shake the ocean apart. The Japanese hydrophones can hear them from 5 kilometers away. It's suicide to keep them running. It's suicide to shut them off. No matter what he does, something dies, outside somewhere. Out there in the dark, a Japanese destroyer races across the water, 30 knots of steel slicing through the Pacific, heading straight for them. It's 800 yards away now, maybe less. Chen feels the vibration in his chest, like a heartbeat. That isn't his. He knows that sound. He's read every after-action report, every log, every death summary. 12 boats gone in 8 weeks. All because the enemy heard them coming. They called it speed doctrine. Move fast, hit hard, but speed means noise, and noise means death. Every time the engines roared, Japanese sonar operators smiled. He remembers Morrison's laugh on the dock the night before his last mission. 2 cigarettes shared between friends, the sun setting over Tulagi. The promise to open a garage in Seattle after the war. Morrison and Chen auto repair 50-50 partnership. He remembers shaking his hand, remembers the grin, remembers the sound of PT 44 leaving the harbor in the fireball that came hours later. The memory sits in his gut like shrapnel. He can still see the flames on the horizon. He can still smell burning fuel. Every report says the same thing. The Japanese hear them at 4 miles open fire. At 2, hit them before the torpedoes are even armed. The water becomes a graveyard of plywood and courage. Chen studied those patterns night after night. He sat in the operations tent while others slept, combing through carbon copies of mission logs. He saw what no one wanted to admit. The problem isn't tactics. It's noise. The ocean is a drum, and their engines are hammers. He learned to listen long before the Navy. He grew up in Oakland, fixing motorcycles with his father. Grease under his nails before he ever learned algebra. He knew how engines talked when they were sick, when they were scared, when they were dying. And for 3 weeks he's been hearing something wrong. The way the Packards sound underwater, not on the surface underwater. It's not just loud, it's unbearable. A freight train in the ocean. He discovered it by accident, fixing a coolant leak on PT 109. He was under the hull in clear, warm water. The sound of waves above him, fish darting through sunlight. Then he heard it, a low, endless roar rattling his bones. The engines weren't even at full throttle, just idle. He dove deeper, the vibration shaking his teeth. When the engines cut off, the silence hit like a void. Suddenly he could hear everything, the movement of fish, the chain of a distant anchor, the soft murmur of other boats. Silence was power. Silence was life. He climbed back aboard, dripping salt and panic found his lieutenant. "Sir, the engines are too loud, underwater, really loud, even at idle." The officer didn't even look up. "That's why we use speed. Chen, outrun them before they can target us." "Sir, if we drifted in..." "Chen, I've got reports to file. We're wheels up in 4 hours. Get them ready." That was 3 weeks ago. He never mentioned it again until now. Now the lieutenant gives that same order himself. Cut the engines, go silent, drift. Chen doesn't know if it's desperation or memory, but the words land like fate. He exhales slowly, pulls back the throttles. The Packards drop from a roar to a growl. The deck stops trembling. The air grows thin. The sound fades lower, lower, until the only thing left is his breathing. Then nothing. Silence so deep, it hums. The lieutenant's voice comes through the intercom again, quiet enough to sound like prayer. Drift toward the target. No engines, no talking. No movement. PT. 109 slides forward on sheer momentum. 5 knots, maybe less. 800 yards from a destroyer that could erase them in seconds. Chen watches through a small porthole. The horizon is nothing but black shapes against black sky. The destroyer's silhouette appears, massive steel alive with men and guns. He can see faint light glinting off metal. 400 yards and closing. The water whispers against the hull, a sound so delicate, it feels sacred. Somewhere above him, someone's breathing too loud. Somewhere behind him, a tool shifts on the deck and every man freezes. The Japanese destroyer keeps moving. Unaware, searchlights snap on, sweeping across the water, white beams slicing the dark. One passes 50 yards from PT 109. Chen's heart stops. The light glows off waves and keeps moving. The crew doesn't breathe. The searchlight sweeps back 70 yards to port, misses again, passes harmlessly. The destroyer's crew searches for wakes, for noise, for movement. They never look for silence. 3 minutes stretch into forever. 5 minutes. The searchlights keep scanning empty water. The destroyer engines thrum low steady, confident. The Japanese sonar operator, Teishi Yamamoto, sits in his cabin, hydrophones pressed to his ears. He's been tracking the distinctive howl of American Packards for 40 minutes. The signature is gone, vanished. He adjusts dials, changes frequency, listens harder. Nothing. No roar, no propeller chop, no mechanical pulse. American PT, boats don't go silent. He's helped sink 11 of them. He knows the sound of their death and life, but now there is nothing. He checks his equipment, pulls off the headphones, puts them back. Still nothing. He reports to his captain, Lieutenant Commander Shunaku Kudo. "Sir, contact lost engine, noise ceased, bearing unknown." Kudo doesn't believe it. He takes the headset himself, listens. Only the hum of their own engines, the whisper of waves. The Americans are gone, maybe engine failure, maybe dead in the water. He orders searchlights again, scan everything. The beams rake across the sound again and again, illuminating only black water and white spray. PT. 109 drifts, unseen, 200 yards away. Chen's knuckles are white around a handrail. He can hear the Japanese ship groaning, the turbine spinning. He can smell diesel in the wind. He realizes they've done it. The destroyer doesn't see them, doesn't hear them. They are ghosts, silent in a sea of steel. At 2:19 a.m., 300 yards, perfect torpedo range. The lieutenant's voice barely a breath. Fire tubes 1 and 2. Chen braces. The torpedoes slide into the water almost soundless. The engines hum like whispers. He counts in his head. 20 seconds. 30. 40. Then the night splits open. Twin explosions tear through the destroyer's port side. Fire erupts. Orange against black metal screams through the ocean. The blast throws shockwaves through PT-109's hull. Chen staggers, grips the console. The destroyer lifts its bow, tearing apart. Secondary explosions follow ammunition, cooking off fuel tanks, igniting. The destroyer dies without ever firing a shot. Chen stares out the porthole, eyes wide as the massive ship tilts and burns. The captain aboard Takanami never had a chance. He never heard them, never saw them, never even imagined an enemy that could disappear. The lieutenant shouts. All engines full. Chen twists the ignition, the Packards roar to life. The silence breaks into fury. PT 109 leaps forward 40 knots across the surface. The acceleration throws Chen against the bulkhead. The crew cheers. They just sank a Japanese destroyer with an idea nobody believed. Silence worked. Chen keeps his eyes on the gauges, oil pressure temperature, RPM. The numbers hold steady. The engines scream, but the sound is victory. He isn't celebrating. He's thinking. Thinking about Morrison. Thinking about that day underwater. Thinking about how they didn't need to be faster. They needed to be quieter. The lieutenant calls him up to the bridge. Chen, get up here. He climbs up, wind in his face, flames glowing behind them. The lieutenant stands at the helm, eyes fixed on the distant inferno. How did you know that would work? Chen tells him everything. The underwater test, the roaring engines, the silence, the disbelief. The lieutenant listens without a word. When Chen finishes, he looks toward the horizon, where the destroyer still burns. We test it again tomorrow, he says. Tomorrow night. Another Tokyo Express run. 6 destroyers, same route, same water. This time we'll be waiting. This time we go silent. Chen nods. He doesn't say anything because he knows. This isn't luck. It's evolution. The night has taught him the truth in war. Sometimes the only way to win is to disappear. And for the first time since the war began, the ocean feels like it's on their side. Silence isn't just survival, it's power. The next day, the base felt different, like a place that had learned a dangerous secret. Chen slept in fits and starts, dreams full of roaring engines and black water. And when dusk fell, he walked to the maintenance tent and found 15 mechanics already there, faces lit by a single hanging lamp, hands still smelling of oil, eyes hard from too many nights and too many funerals. He stood before them without ceremony and explained what he'd heard under PT 109's hull, how idle engines made a freight train roar through the sea and how dead silence let the ocean hide a shape even when steel sat inches away. And he drew the shutdown sequence on a chalkboard slow throttle, back positions, 3-stage ignition cut. How to preserve momentum without stalling, how to feather the props to keep steerage when the engines were off, and most important, how to restart under load in under 10 seconds if everything went wrong. The tent listened with that stunned hush troops give when someone tells them the only way out might be to stop fighting the way they were taught. And Rodriguez from Texas, who'd scoffed at first, kept his pen moving, his jaw set, while the young Californian, who worried about failed restarts, swallowed and nodded, because they'd all seen friends incinerated while roaring in, and they'd all read the same reports Chen had, the same charts showing hydrophone bearings and ranges, the same cruel math that said if you announce yourself at 3 miles, you will be dead by 2. They practiced on maintenance runs that night, cut engines at exactly 800 yards, feel the boat coast to 400, fire, then hammer the starters and throttle hard, over and over until hands moved without thought, until even the youngest mechanic could feel the timing in his bones. And when December first came, the sky was flat and the sea a black mirror, 8 PTS lined across the expected route like teeth in the dark, engines cold, crews frozen and small against the yawning water, moments stretching into something like prayer. The Japanese convoy moved through on Schedule 6 destroyers, in column heavy with supplies, confident in doctrine and hydrophones. The sonar operator aboard Takanami Teishi Yamamoto pressed his headset and heard nothing but the sea's breath and his own ship's pulse. And when the searchlight swept the waves, They found empty water, no wakes, no signature, no angry mechanical scream. At 1:52 a.m., 16 torpedoes slipped into the dark like quiet vipers and hit in catastrophic sequence. 4 destroyers struck. Within minutes, 2 sank, 2 crippled, and the formation broke apart in fire and horror. While the PTS restarted together in a thunderclap and ran like shadows at 40 knots away from the inferno, the radio crackling with exultation and disbelief. Headquarters read the after-action with staring officers who checked their math twice. 8 PTS versus 6 destroyers, 4 hit 0. American losses. It was impossible until the logs and sonar reports and survivor statements matched. And then doctrine flipped overnight. Field innovations became instruction manuals, and within days squadrons across the Solomons were practicing silent running mechanics, teaching mechanics. Crews whispering the new protocol into the night. Word spread not through a formal memo, but through cigarettes and shared wrenches and quiet corrections in bunks. The guy who had been a kid from Oakland, who could hear a failing bearing under load, had changed how you attacked the sea, and Japanese captains wrote furious reports blaming secret silencers or rubber mounts or stealth hulls while their analysts missed the obvious. Desperation beat doctrine, and desperation had learned to be sent. Chen never sought a headline. His name appears only once in official ink. MM2 Chen R advised engine shutdown protocols for noise reduction effective. But the men who lived because of that one line told the story in other ways, in quiet salutes years later, in crude carved initials on bunks, and in the way younger mechanics traced their thumbs along the engine mounts and smiled when they heard a Packard cough back to life. And as the tactic spread, it cost the Japanese the safe night navigation they'd relied on. Tokyo Express runs thinned. Destroyers demanded air cover before threading Iron Bottom Sound at night. And the nightmare of losing boats, because you could be heard from 3 miles, receded like a tide, replaced by a new fear in enemy hearts. The invisible approach. Chen taught the protocol to dozens of mechanics. By spring of 1943, he trained men who would teach it as doctrine. And it became law, not because Admiralty decreed it, but because it worked and survivors insisted. He moved from PT-109 to PT-157, kept his head down, tightened bolts, checked gauges, fixed what broke, and taught what they had to know to keep boats quiet until the moment they struck. And when after the war, a historian knocked on his door in 1989 and asked if he'd really been first to suggest cutting engines, he shrugged and said he'd just noticed they were loud and stopped them from being loud, because to him it had never been invention or glory, but the grating reality of losing his friend Tommy Morrison, who joked about a garage in Seattle and died when speed and noise betrayed him. The Navy quietly recognized technical merit. Chen earned a Navy Cross that skimmed the surface of his work, but did not tell the whole thing. His daughters learned the rest years later from dusty logs and a plaque in a PT museum that credited a silent running protocol to a machinist whose name most history books never mention, and the principle he proved became the seed of an acoustic revolution. Submarines went quieter. Destroyers fitted better sonar. Navies invested in sound suppression and stealth, and the lesson that silence can be as lethal as a salvo passed down through fleets until the doctrines of the later Cold War and modern navies carried his idea into steel and circuitry far beyond the wooden hulls of the Solomons. Chen lived out his life with grease under his nails and a motorcycle shop on Telegraph Avenue, never hungry for statues, content with engines that started when they should, and men who returned to wives and children because they had the chance. And on nights when the Pacific brushed the San Francisco piers, he'd sometimes stop and listen to the water and remember a different ocean where silence had been invented by a mechanic who heard a train in the sea and chose to stop hammering on the drum. He never bragged, never told his daughters about the torpedoes that vanished into the dark or the night the ocean swallowed fire. To them, he was just Dad, the man who smelled like metal and gasoline, who fixed every neighbor's motorcycle for the price of a story. They didn't know that in 1942 their father had been a ghost in the Pacific, that the sound of silence he'd created had rewritten the logic of naval combat. For Bobby Chen, the war became memory compressed into habits, the way he still listened to engines with his eyes closed, the way he always paused before turning the ignition key, the way he flinched at the pop of fireworks every 4th of July. When he finally told the historian the story, he said it plain. I didn't invent anything. I just noticed we were too loud. The man wrote it down, tried to explain that noticing is sometimes the difference between life and extinction. But Chen waved it off and changed the oil on an old Triumph. The Navy Cross hung behind the register next to a faded black and white of two young men in coveralls, one grinning, one squinting into the sun. Underneath, in pencil, someone had written Morrison in Chen Garage, coming soon. By the late 90s, old PT sailors started showing up at his shop, gray and bent, but still sharp enough to find the address. They'd shake his hand and say nothing for a moment, just look at him, like they were staring at a miracle that never got a headline. One of them, Rodriguez still walking with a cane from shrapnel, said quietly, "You remember that night we drifted in? I still hear it when I sleep." That silence saved me. Chen nodded, poured him coffee, and changed the subject to spark plugs. It was his way of honoring what couldn't be spoken. The guilt, the relief, the strange beauty of having survived. When he died in 2003, the obituaries were short. Robert Chen, veteran, mechanic, father of two. No mention of the doctrine that still echoes through the Navy's classrooms. No mention of Bottom Sound, or the night a destroyer died without ever hearing the enemy approach. But 6 men in their 80s came anyway, veterans of Squadron 3. They brought a folded flag, a rusted wrench, and a small brass plate engraved with a single phrase, "Silent Running, 1942. One of them spoke briefly over the sound of the harbor. Bobby never wanted credit. He just wanted the boats to come home. Then they placed the wrench on his casket and saluted. The sea wind carried the sound away. Years later, a naval engineer visiting the PT Museum in Fall River noticed the little plaque by the engine room that read Silent Running Protocol, developed by Chief Machinist's mate, Robert Chen, 1942. He asked the curator about it. The man smiled and said, "That's the reason these engines don't roar in vain. Every time the Packards are fired for demonstrations, the crowd covers its ears at the first blast. Then, when the curator cuts the ignition, the sudden silence makes everyone gasp, a physical echo of the moment when war itself paused long enough for survival to slip through." In naval academies, instructors still mention a nameless machinist from the Solomons when teaching acoustic warfare. They talk about the shift from power to stealth, from volume to control. They rarely mention that it started not in a lab, but under a wooden hull with a young man holding his breath in warm Pacific water, listening to how sound carried death. The students scribble notes, not realizing they are tracing the legacy of a man who simply refused to accept that noise was inevitable. And so the story continues, mostly unspoken, in every vessel that glides without a trace, in every sonar ping that finds nothing because someone once dared to be quiet. The modern destroyers hum softly through the world's oceans, their noise signatures measured in decibels so low that even whales ignore them. Submarines drift like shadows, their crews trained to move as Chen once moved, steady, patient, invisible. The engineers designing them don't think about 1942, but the ghosts of the Bottom Sound are in the blueprints. Sometimes, on anniversaries, a small group of historians and sailors gather at the coordinates where PT-109 made its silent run. They toss flowers into the water and let them drift. No speeches, no trumpets, just the slap of waves against the hull. The ocean there is still deep, still quiet. Somewhere far below lies the twisted steel of the Takanami, its engines frozen forever, surrounded by the hush that killed it. If you listen long enough, the sea itself seems to remember the night it learned what silence could do. That's the legacy of Robert Bobby Chen, not a monument of marble, not a chapter in schoolbooks, but a principle that outlived him. That sometimes survival isn't about being louder, faster, stronger. It's about being still long enough to hear what others miss. The story ends the way it began, with a mechanic listening to the ocean and realizing that the quietest sound in war is the sound of men coming home. Decades passed, and the story of that night at Iron Bottom Sound slipped into the archives, filed under routine operations, nothing to distinguish it from thousands of other skirmishes. Yet the silence itself refused to die. The engineers who had studied post-war sonar kept finding references to one engagement where American PT boats had disappeared acoustically. They traced the data, the frequencies, the patterns, and every road led back to the same date, November 30th, 1942. They found the maintenance log with the line about noise reduction protocols and began to realize that some anonymous mechanic had stumbled onto a principle that would define the next century of warfare. By the time the Navy began commissioning its first nuclear submarines, silent running had become gospel. Manuals that once celebrated speed now preached stillness. Training exercises simulated that same breathless drift Chen had invented by instinct. Crews learned to cut every unnecessary system, to move like ghosts through the deep, to let the enemy's sensors chase phantom echoes. The instructors didn't know the name that started it all, but they carried his discovery in every whisper of their doctrine. In 1976, when sonar analysts aboard the USS Los Angeles managed to pass within a mile of a Soviet sub without detection, they celebrated quietly in the control room. The captain, an old PT veteran, smiled and muttered, "Bobby would have liked that." No one asked who Bobby was, but the word stuck. A few years later, one of Chen's grandsons joined the Navy as an acoustic technician. He never met his grandfather, but he'd heard pieces of the legend from his father, an old mechanic who'd once turned the tide by turning everything off. The grandson didn't believe it at first. It sounded like one of those family myths inflated by time, until during a briefing he saw a single slide in a training presentation labeled Origins of Silent Running, Solomon's, 1942. He froze. The name wasn't there, but the story matched perfectly. After class, he asked the instructor who had invented it. The man shrugged. "No one knows. Some machinist, I think. Just a kid who didn't want to die." That night, the grandson sat alone in his barracks, listening to the hum of the ship around him, the air system, the soft mechanical breathing of the vessel, and thought about how silence had saved lives before he was born. He wrote his grandfather's name in the margin of his notebook next to the word innovation. He realized that sometimes history doesn't need credit to survive. It just keeps working quietly in the background, the way good machines do. Back in Oakland, the old garage on Telegraph Avenue still stood, paint flaking, doors chained shut. A young couple bought it and turned it into a cafe, keeping the name painted faintly above the entrance, Morrison and Chen. Most customers never noticed, just assumed it was a quirky brand. But sometimes sailors who'd heard the story from someone who'd served decades earlier would stop by, run their hand across the old letters, and smile. The waitress didn't know why old men sometimes tipped heavily and left folded pieces of paper with small drawings of PT boats on the napkins. In 2019, a filmmaker digging through declassified naval files found that single maintenance log entry and followed it back to Chen's family. The film he made wasn't a blockbuster. No explosions, no CGI, just interviews with historians and the few remaining veterans who remembered a quiet mechanic and a night when the ocean itself became a weapon. The film ended with that same line Chen had said to the historian, "I didn't invent anything. I just stopped us from being loud." When it premiered, The theater fell silent at the last frame. People didn't clap right away. They just sat there, listening to the credits roll over the faint sound of waves. Today, cadets at the Naval War College still study the doctrine of acoustic evasion. In the appendix of one textbook, there's a brief historical note. The practice originated in the South Pacific during the Guadalcanal campaign, when American PT boats first employed engine cutoff tactics to achieve stealth. No names, no medals, no heroes, just a line of text. But those who know the story smile when they read it. Because behind every doctrine, behind every technological leap, there's always someone like Chen. Someone who hears the world differently and dares to act on it. And somewhere out there, in the vast Pacific night, the waves still whisper against the hulls of ships that glide in silence, carrying forward the lesson born from one man's grief. One man's stubborn refusal to let noise dictate death. The engines are quieter now, but they still hum with the memory of that mechanic who proved that sometimes the loudest victory is the one nobody hears.